It is a new year. We are in 2023. It is now the first month of this new year, and a lot has changed, and I'm going to be talking about Venezuela. So, in 2023, the pretend presidency of Juan Guaido has come to an end. Juan Guaido, who declared himself the president of Venezuela in 2019 to challenge Nicolas Maduro, never took power. He never had anything to show for, and now he's even been rejected by the Venezuelan opposition, who decided recently to vote and end his interim government. This is a huge blow and embarrassment for the United States, who for the past 3 years kept propping up Juan Guaido, claiming he's the real president of Venezuela. And now that pretend presidency has ended. I also want to make a comparison between Juan Guaido and another political figure from the past in Latin America, Guillermo and Dara. Guillermo and Dara was the U.S. installed president of Panama from December 1989 until 1994. Guillermo and Dara was an opposition figure to the Manuel Noriega dictatorship in Panama, and Guillermo and Dara tried running for president in 1989. And so when the United States ended up invading Panama in December 1989 and overthrew the Noriega dictatorship, the U.S. immediately helped install Guillermo and Dara as president of Panama, and his presidency was quite messy and had a lot of corruption scandals. There's a lot of unemployment and crime from 1990 to 94, and he became quite unpopular with the Panamanian people, and the really only thing propping him up was the United States, in particular the U.S. military forces occupying Panama at the time. Guillermo and Dara, examples of a U.S. puppet president, and Juan Guaido was supposed to be that, but it failed. He was another Guillermo and Dara, but he failed to come to power in Venezuela. So if we really look at Juan Guaido and his interim government, they had nothing to show for. The military never joined his side. The courts of Venezuela never joined his side. He never gained control of the country. The military of Venezuela stood behind Maduro and his government. So did the courts, and Maduro remained in control of all the natural resources and the oil in Venezuela. At the very most, Juan Guaido was able to gain control of the foreign assets of Venezuela in places like England or in the United States in particular, and that's it. Juan Guaido kept calling himself the president of Venezuela year after year and had nothing to show for, and it looked more and more silly and ridiculous each passing year. And the Venezuelan people themselves lost interest, and they moved on from Juan Guaido because he had nothing to show for. He had no results to show for, and he just kind of became a joke. So I have to clarify, I am not a supporter of Nicolas Maduro and his socialist dictatorship, because they have no legitimacy either. They're a repressive dictatorship who have totally mismanaged Venezuela over the years and plunged the country into economic meltdown and turmoil. They're very repressive. They rig elections. They're terrible, and they do need to step down. But Juan Guaido and his pretend government was a real embarrassment also, and had no legitimacy. So back in 2018, the United States decided to sever relations with Venezuela, and then they decided to recognize Juan Guaido as the president and tried to do a campaign of isolating Nicolas Maduro and his government in Venezuela and putting economic sanctions on Venezuela, trying to do all these regime change efforts, trying to plan military coups, and none of it worked. And some countries that went along briefly with the United States ended up abandoning this stuff, such as the European Union. They ended up abandoning recognizing Juan Guaido, and in recent years, other countries in Latin America now have gone back to reestablishing ties with Venezuela and Maduro. So Colombia and Brazil in particular are countries whose severed relations with Venezuela have gone back to opening the borders and relations with Nicolas Maduro and no longer recognize Juan Guaido. The United States was the last country that kept insisting that Juan Guaido is the real president of Venezuela. So now that the Venezuelan opposition has terminated Juan Guaido's fake presidency and ended his fake interim government, the United States really looks embarrassed. And now another thing that needs to be talked about, and I made a video on it earlier, is how the U.S. contradicts itself, how it is doing back to oil business with the Maduro government, even though they keep saying they don't recognize them. The U.S. has eased sanctions on Venezuela and allowed Chevron, the oil company Chevron, to go back to business with Venezuela, purchasing Venezuelan crude oil. The U.S. had to talk to Maduro because Juan Guaido is not in control of the oil in Venezuela. Maduro and his government is. And the U.S. contradicts itself and looks like it's all over the place when it's buying oil from a government they don't even officially recognize and that they condemn all the time. And so now the U.S. is going to have to eventually be forced to eventually restore relations with Venezuela if it's going to keep buying the oil, or it's just going to keep losing its credibility and contradicting itself, buying oil from a government that they have been trying to topple and failed to topple. I want to just say in conclusion that going forward, now that the U.S. is at this stalemate when it comes to Venezuela and its regime change efforts totally failed, America needs to stop forced regime change efforts in Venezuela. The U.S. should stop the economic sanctions because that only made the economic situation worse in Venezuela and it made the migrant situation worse. The U.S. just looks like it's behind since pretty much every other country, such as in South America and Central America and also Europe, have restored relations with the Maduro government in Venezuela. The U.S. might as well go back to relations with Maduro and his government because it just looks out of place and behind everyone else. The U.S. should try going back to diplomacy when it comes to negotiations between the Venezuela's opposition and the Maduro government, but the U.S. should not continue trying to plan coups in Venezuela or intervention or trying to set up some parallel government because all of that failed and it makes the U.S. really look ridiculous and silly. I am not in favor of any more American foreign interventions in Latin America, which end up causing so much damage.